All right, so let's start first with the state of the social networks, where they stand right now as of March 2020 in terms of user base, growth, health financially. And this is a really important first step for you to take with students. This is actually the very first lecture I give to students in my advanced social media class. It's obviously a very short version of that lecture. But I think it's important for them to know all these things as we then begin to start talking about strategy behind all these platforms. First, you need to know where they are and what they're doing. So let's start first with Facebook. Still the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Still the biggest, still the healthiest, still making the most money despite what you hear in regular media. So we'll take a look at some of the numbers and data and see where they stand. Here's a quick timeline of Facebook, and you can pause this if you need to and read more of these things. I don't want to go over everything, but Facebook launched in 2004, so it's more than 16 years old now, which is kind of crazy to think about. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg's still the face of the company. Chris Hughes, also one of the co-founders, left to run President Obama's social media campaign during his election run. And has since become a pretty vocal anti-Facebook person. So that's been interesting to watch. Again, you can read all this history as you want, but in 2006, those are really some of the biggest changes. So that's when Newsfeed launched. And that's when, instead of having to go to somebody's individual page to see their content, Facebook found a way to bring that content to you, which has changed everything. Of course, that's the birth of the algorithm, which we can talk about more in person with that, but it also opened the doors for anyone to join in 2006. So that meant businesses could be a part of it, and that meant money could be made, which again, Facebook's still making a ton of money right now as it continues on as a platform. Again, you can see all the way through here down to 2020, where they're now testing a major redesign. One of my former students is actually part of the beta of this. So in the next video, I'm going to show you some of the changes that Facebook is testing right now. We'll also talk about Cambridge Analytica here in just a second. So here are the numbers from the fourth quarter of 2019. So this is the latest earnings report that Facebook has given. 2.5 billion monthly active users. Again, that number continues to go up. 1.66 billion daily active users. So I always stop right here and talk to students of what is an active user. I usually ask them, how many of y'all consider yourselves active users? And nobody will raise their hands. And then when you explain to them that an active user is somebody who just simply opened the app or went onto Facebook, it does not mean you posted content. It does not mean you engaged with anything. Then usually all of them say they were active users. So a monthly active user is someone who's done that at least once a month. Daily active user, someone who's done that once a day. For the fourth quarter of 2019, Facebook made more than $21 billion. And again, that was up 25% from the fourth quarter of 2018. So still no, dip in revenue despite all of the bad news Facebook has been dealing with over the past couple years. Continues to make a ton of money. Will it always stay that way? No, of course not. But for now, there is no end in sight in terms of Facebook's growth with ad revenue. Most of that comes from ads on mobile, which makes total sense. People are primarily viewing Facebook on mobile, so that makes sense. And then their standalone apps also doing really well. Facebook Messenger, which is the chat app, has more than 1 billion monthly users alone with that. So I promised we'd talk about Cambridge Analytica. You probably already heard of this, but just a quick recap in case you haven't. Facebook's been in a scandal for the past couple of years regarding Cambridge Analytica. And what this was a third-party developer created a quiz that collected data on people, which Facebook allows. You probably see those all the time. Which personality type are you, or things like that. But what this third-party company did was they then went and sold the data to politicians to then target specific ads to. And that was very much against Facebook's guidelines. So despite the fact that it was against Facebook's guidelines, rules of service, that was Facebook's defense. Hey, we told them they couldn't do that. They still made it possible to do that, which has led to all kinds of fallout. Zuckerberg's had to testify in front of Congress a couple times. They've been fined by the FTC billions and billions of dollars. But in the end, when researchers have gone in and asked people if they really care about this, they've overwhelmingly said no. So it's kind of a sad state of affairs that people aren't really caring what happens with their data, or they didn't really see that big of a deal. But we'll continue to monitor it. Facebook's still dealing with the fallout from Cambridge Analytica and what it holds for the future. Facebook, of course, also owns Instagram. Again, a really quick rundown of Instagram's history. Kevin Systrom on the right, Mike Krieger on the left there. Systrom was the CEO. Both were the co-founders. Very quickly became very popular and very quickly bought by Facebook for $1 billion in 2012. At the time, people thought Facebook was crazy for buying Instagram for $1 billion, and now that's quite a bargain. The algorithm started a couple years later. Of course, Facebook tried to buy Snapchat, which we'll talk about here in a second. When Snapchat said no, Facebook said, okay, well, we're just going to steal your idea then, and created Instagram Stories, which has now translated to Facebook Stories. Systrom and Krieger both resigned in 2018. It seemed like they had kind of gotten fed up with Facebook having its hands in everything. And so they've been gone for coming up on 2 years now. In fact, it happened this time 2 years ago. And we'll talk about who replaced them in just a second. And then last year, Instagram began testing hiding likes on posts, which could potentially have a big impact on the way we think about social media from a psychological standpoint. So if you haven't read about that, I'd highly encourage you to find some articles related to that. It's an interesting discussion to have with students. Here's Instagram's numbers. Again, this is early 2020. More than 1 billion monthly active users. Facebook hasn't updated that number in quite a while, so that's probably on the low end of user base now. 500 million plus daily active users. People who use Instagram tend to check it a ton. Instagram Stories has 500 million plus daily active users, which is double what Snapchat has. So in terms of the size of these platforms, Instagram Stories is so much bigger than Snapchat. And Facebook, for the first time, actually revealed some of the numbers in terms of ad revenue from Instagram. Instagram in 2019 generated about 20 billion in ad revenue, which was about a quarter of Facebook's revenue for the year. And Instagram's actually bigger than YouTube in terms of ad revenue. So that was pretty interesting to see. Here's the guy who just took over when Systrom and Krieger stepped down. This is Adam Mosseri. He has the very strange title of head of Instagram, but he was previously in charge of Facebook's newsfeed, which means he was in charge of the algorithm. So he's played a key role in the Facebook corporation for quite a while now. So let's really quickly talk about Twitter. Again, launched 2006, so about 14 years ago. Jack Dorsey was one of the co-founders, is still currently the CEO. We'll talk about him in just a second. Really, Twitter burst on the scene at South by Southwest in 2007 as all the tech world got together and started finding ways to communicate. And Twitter went public in 2013, and it's been a pretty bumpy road for Twitter over the past 7 or so years. But the good news is Twitter is finally profitable. So here are some of the statistics with Twitter. They have more than 150. They use a term called monetizable daily active users. Really what that means is these are people who've not only opened the app, but these were people who were able to be shown ads. So that's the term that Twitter uses to describe them. But you can see that number is pretty small. It is growing though. So they grew 21% year to year. Twitter made $1 billion in revenue for the fourth quarter of 2019. 2018 was its first profitable year. It was also profitable in 2019, and now they're hopeful that it's going to remain that way over the time being. I mentioned Jack Dorsey. He's had an interesting past couple of weeks. He was one of the first people to drop out of South by Southwest, and a lot of people viewed that as a convenient excuse, using coronavirus as a convenient excuse because there was a hostile takeover going on at the time with Twitter. Investment corporation bought a bunch of Twitter stock and wanted Dorsey out as CEO. They've since made a deal to keep him in place, but with an eye on replacing him in the very near future. So we'll watch and see what happens as that comes about. Snapchat, speaking of companies that have had a rough go of it, Snapchat definitely has as well. So these are the two co-founders of Snapchat, Evan Spiegel on the right, Bobby Murphy on the left. I mentioned that Snapchat famously turned down a $3 billion offer from Facebook, and it's kind of all been downhill from Snapchat ever since then. They bet on themselves, and it hasn't exactly worked out, at least from a financial standpoint. The company is now known as Snap. That's the parent company. Snapchat is part of Snap. Spectacles, Bitmoji, and things like that are also underneath the parent company. Snapchat is, much to its pleasure, I'm sure, now growing users again. For a long time, they were dropping in users every quarter. But they're now up to 218 million daily active users. Remember, that number is 500 million for Instagram stories. It does make money, so they made about $500 million in revenue for the fourth quarter, which was up quite a bit, but they're still operating at a big loss on the year. So Snapchat's still not profitable despite going public several years ago, and it's getting better, but it's still not at the point of profitability. Snapchat also still has major investment from overseas, so they've taken on investments from Saudi Arabia and Tencent, which is a Chinese company that mostly runs video games, but also a lot of social platforms over there. So it's interesting to see how those will play a role in Snapchat's future. And then the last one I want to talk to you about is TikTok, which has kind of blown up on the scene here in the past couple of years, even though it's been around for quite a while. So this was actually created in 2016. And the introduction to the American market happened in 2018 when TikTok merged with an app called Musical.ly, which allowed mostly teenagers and little kids to lip sync to music, which, if you use TikTok, you know that that's a big use of TikTok now. So that was really opening the door for TikTok in the American audience, which is why we think of it now today. TikTok has a bunch of users, 800 million monthly active users, and people use it all the time. So its users check the app 8 times a day on average. And ByteDance, which is the company that created TikTok, valued somewhere around $80 billion. So that's a real quick rundown of the health of these platforms and where they stand. And I always like to close this lecture with this quote from a student. This was on my very first course evaluation for this course. A student left a statement that said, "Students think we know this stuff and we don't." That's not to say that students don't know how to use these platforms. That's not what we're teaching them. We're teaching them the strategy behind these platforms. So as you think about ways you might want to teach social or incorporate social into your classes, it's not teaching them how to create an Instagram post or teaching them how to, make a TikTok. That's not it. It's talking about the strategy behind these from a marketing perspective, from a journalism perspective, things like that. And I always tell students that's okay. That's why we're here. Hopefully it sets the right mindset for the rest of the semester.